Hello there, it's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter podcast. One of the reasons that I love making this podcast for you every week is because I know what it's like to feel like you're not quite in the right place. I mean, people are nice and I love my friends, but I have a different connection with other artists. When artists get together, they light up. Normally shy or introverted people suddenly become animated and hard to shut up. That's how I know I've found my tribe. You know what I mean, right? It's like Helen Mar said in an iTunes review. When I found this, she says, it made a world of difference. Now I feel in touch again with artists. I have my peeps and they are here. First off, thank you so much, Helen Mar. And as I hope you've discovered from this podcast, you most definitely are not alone, even if it feels that way sometimes in your studio. Savvy Painter has been downloaded over 1 million times by artists in 150 countries. This is the place where you will find your community. You'll be inspired to push your paintings to the next level and discover how to confidently share your voice with the people who are waiting to hear it. And that's just from listening to the podcast. At least that's what people tell me. You can get even more when you join the Savvy Painter email list. When you sign up now, you get essential tips for artists, a free PDF filled with inspiring quotes and practical advice collected from years of Savvy Painter interviews. Go to savvypainter.com/subscribe. It is that easy to join us. Kenny Harris is my guest this week. Kenny is an artist originally from Northern California. He moved around and traveled extensively until finally landing in Venice Beach, California. In this episode, we talk about the ebb and flow of art sales and what the old guard in Venice taught him. A lot has changed in the art world in the last decade. With all the benefits of social media and the ability of artists to connect directly with their audience, it has also become a tug of war for attention. We talk about self-promotion, how it can feel kind of awkward to be part of the noise and sometimes exhausting to participate in it. Just like in real life, we grow and mature as artists. We go through stages, sometimes full of bravado, when we crank out a ton of work, getting our 10,000 hours in or the miles and miles of canvas. Kenny talks about this stage of his development and how he began to slow down, purposefully creating fewer paintings, but allowing himself the time and space to be more thoughtful and savor the process. In doing this, Kenny began to question his assumptions about the art he was making. As he puts it, he became cautious about the abundance of caution, and I love that observation. Kenny learned that being a thoughtful painter encourages expansion in the work, while an abundance of caution invites contraction. Kenny is married to the artist Judy Nimtz, and he shares how they influence each other, are able to critique each other's work, and some of the pros and cons of being married to another artist. Fortunately for them both, there are lots of pros and very few cons, as Kenny tells it. So without further ado, here is Kenny Harris. Kenny, thank you so much for being on the Savvy Painter podcast. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got started as an artist? What sort of prompted you to dedicate yourself to painting?
I think young experiences going to Europe in high school, looking at things like the Sistine Chapel and stuff, I think inspired me to kind of be a part of this ongoing continuum of painters. And I think I was always painting on the side. When I got out of college, I was sort of doing my own work and having little underground shows and stuff. And I moved to New York in late 90s. And then when I came out to LA in 2001 is when I kind of made the leap to becoming a full-time painter and saying, no other jobs, except for little maybe side catering jobs, little things to pay the rent. But that's when I kind of made the big step.
Was there something that prompted you to do that?
I was working in animation and I was kind of successful at it. And I kind of could see myself going in that direction. But I'm sitting here in front of a computer screen thinking to myself, I really should be a painter. Like that's really where my love was, sort of that silence and slow time of, observational painting. And I was like, and New York was not making me happy. I'm like, I gotta get out of here. And a friend had a studio space in Venice, big studio space. And he said, come out here and work. So I said, yes. So I left New York.
So tell me what it was like. I'm always curious about this when you make a big leap like that. When you got to Venice, like your first day there, what were you thinking?
Well, it was going to be temporary. I was going to come out for the summer and then go home back to New York. And when I left New York, I actually traveled through Central America for 2 months painting. So I was doing my little like wannabe grand tour style painting of like ruins and stuff like that. And then I got to LA and I just was like ready to eat it up, like consume as many experiences as possible, like being at the beach all the time, seeing friends around, painting, drawing, painting. It was kind of a manic, fun lifestyle.
Uh-huh.
And at the end of the summer, I had this kind of underground show, invited everyone, and it was great. And LA sort of opened its arms to me. And like 3 days later, after that little show, September 11th happened.
Oh.
So New York's a mess. All my friends back in New York were like, you do not want to be here. It's awful here. And LA, meanwhile, had sort of welcomed me in. And I was raised in Northern California, so I'm a California kid. Never thought I'd live in LA, like so many people down here. Mm-hmm. But it turned out it was a great, fit. Venice Beach and the old artists that I knew here, kind of the old guard of modernists and light and space painters and stuff that I met, they sort of gave me insight into kind of showed me the ropes a little bit from a perspective of experience that none of my peers had. That was a really, I think, a leg up for me when I got here.
What were some of your biggest takeaways from those conversations with the old guards?
Well, I think they saw me having sort of young success too. Like, people liked my work. I was sort of the new kid on the block in LA, making these little, paintings of interior spaces and stuff. And no one else was really doing that around here. And they said, this is great. You're doing great, but art is cyclical. Like it's going to come and go. You'll have periods where you do really well and periods where you don't do so well, and know that you have to kind of play for the averages.
That is great advice.
That was very good advice. And not to play to fashion, any sort of fashion of the day, just sort of be true to yourself, because that's going to end up paying off in the long run. And then the idea that, you can get magazine articles and all this stuff, and none of it's actually going to like blow up your career. There's no magic bullet. It's this kind of year after year putting in a time that will pay off.
So can you talk a little bit about what happened? First of all, that's great advice. I love it. But can you talk a little bit about once you decided you were going to stay in Venice, how did you get yourself established? The
first year was a little bit random, but the thing that actually got me established in LA was the Venice Art Walk, which is a big sort of, at the time, a prestigious kind of unique open studios tour that was curated. You had to sort of apply to get on it. And I was on the Venice Art Walk that first year because of where the studio was located. And that one open studios where I had all this, all this new work, sold it all, a couple galleries were interested right away, just from that one sort of exposure. I think what's changed from then, that was 2002, to now, is that back then, something like 1,500, 2,000 people came through my studio that day.
Wow.
And these were like, real art people, looky-loos also, but also people that came to buy. And I feel like the fight for attention now is extreme. Like you can't just say, we're having this event and everyone shows up. I feel like there's this kind of tug and war on everyone's intention and what you're going to actually attend every week. I feel like there's so many invites that come in everyone's inboxes, where in the past it was one postcard, one event. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. What do you think caused that change?
I think social media and everyone sort of having to self-promote. There's like this shouting match happening all the time. Whereas in the past, let's say you wanted to go see an art show, you'd go get Gallery Guide, or you'd go look at Art Scene California. You'd go and find out what were the shows, where were the openings. Okay, let's go see this, this, and this. And most people are now just getting bombarded by the loudest voice in their inbox and what they're responding to. And so it's difficult. I think artists have a hard time with this because we're by nature sort of more introspective. We don't want to shout and like promote ourselves on a grandstand, but it's sort of the box that we're now in. And that's a weird thing, where I think back in the past, we did our own self-promotion, but maybe it was sending postcards out to specific people. I have a mailing list of 40 people. I'm going to send those postcards out and people will come.
Right.
And now it's gone digital, and that just becomes a cacophony of information,
Right. Right. Well, I think that, I don't know, it seems like that's the thing that's interesting to me about it, is that because it's so easy, because you don't have to pay 50 cents or 40 cents or whatever it is now to mail something, I think it makes what goes out less thoughtful?
Yeah, you could be thoughtful, but you can't just invite someone once to an event. I feel like you have to invite them like 3 times or something.
Right.
So it's invite them, remind them, and then remind them again.
Right.
And that just seems like I'm so scared of pestering people.
Yeah.
That, it's like it's my probably a flaw in my own marketing gut. But when everyone else is shouting, I don't want to be have to shout louder.
Right.
I think also I was more oblivious when I was younger. I'd just be like, hey, I'm doing this thing. Everyone pay attention. Yay. I was young and like, I don't know if naive is the right word, but
more brash.
Yeah. Just like, I'm doing this thing. And then all of a sudden you get on social media and there's so many people out there doing it. And you're just like, it's not so unique what I'm doing. I'm just one of the masses. Hey,
That's really funny observation.
Well, I mean, it's a funny thing. And I feel like this young artist coming up, my advice, I think, doesn't even work anymore. I've aged out of my good advice. I tell them stuff like, don't worry about the marketing stuff. Just make good, solid work and your career will be great. I mean, if you're making a work that no one can ignore, you will find a dealer that will promote it. So people want to sell it and make money and all this stuff. I mean, like, you should have no problems. And now I'm like, I don't know if that's true. Like, I don't even know if my own advice is sound. I've been doing this just long enough to realize how little I know. And it's kind of funny. At 20 years into my career, I'm much less certain of everything.
I think that's a sign of maturity, though.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I'm a teacher and I'm giving advice to kids, and they're coming at me with like, check out this Instagram stuff, and I'm like, I used to just dismiss it. Now I'm like, I can't dismiss it. It's as valid as anything. All my kind of prejudices and rules, they're all kind of, I feel like an old man all of a sudden.
Well, I think part of that is it is growing up in a sense. We have our physical, like emotional growing up. And when I was a teenager and when I was in my 20s, I had everything figured out. I knew everything that was going on. And then, in my 30s, I was like, whoa, maybe I don't know what's going on. And now I'm just like, yeah, I have no idea. So let's find out, which is kind of more fun in a way because it invites more curiosity. So I think within our progression as artists, we go through those stages too. They're just, kind of longer and later, I think.
Totally. One thing that affected me a lot, I think, was that I started my career around 2001, 2002 in LA, and there was this bull market there for like all these years where art sales were great.
Yeah.
2003, 4, 5, 6, 7.
And then
it was so strong. You just were like, I'm just making paintings and selling them. It's easy. And so 2008 happened, and my show in 2009, like nothing, like anything that happened after that, sales were so flat. And that's when I had to kind of rethink everything. I think a lot of artists out there are still affected by that correction, after 2008. And I kind of assumed that, I would return to that sort of level of, for lack of a better word, effortless sales, And I think that's been the trickiest thing, is sort of recalibrating in a world that there's no certain sales. Even what you think is some of the best work you've ever done, there's no guarantee it's going to sell. I think eventually things all sell, but it's hard to budget that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's not predictable.
Yeah. And so that's been an interesting, I don't know, coming to grips with that over the last decade, like that it's not magically going to get better tomorrow. And I think also I slowed down. I was in a manic pace when I was a young artist. I did way too many paintings. I was trying to do too much. I had a sort of good enough attitude, that idea of like perfect being the enemy of the good. I took that to heart, and I did a lot of paintings. You know what I mean? I cranked out work, and I was more interested in a sort of Hopper-esque or Ashcan school kind of finish rather than a perfection. So I just cranked through iterations of compositions and marrying it with travel so I could live this kind of hybrid lifestyle, experiential existence, which was just awesome. But I slowed down, after the session hit, I just kind of slowed down. I ended up meeting my future wife, Judy, who's also a painter. And so everything just sort of slowed down, the manicness of it. And I think as young artists, to have sort of a kind of forward surging momentum helps a lot, but then it has to kind of go in a cycle or you'll burn yourself out.
Yeah, That makes a lot of sense. And it's, in a way, it seems like the perfect sort of trajectory for growth, that you start off just painting as much as you possibly can and just going through that, the 1,000 paintings or the miles and miles of canvas or whatever, however you want to phrase that.
Absolutely.
And then you start to find the things that really resonate with you, and you can sort of like savor it.
Yeah. The way that sort of manifested for me recently is a friend of mine, Peter Zakowski, is now chair of the MFA at Laguna College of Art and Design, where I teach. Mm-hmm. And I love Peter. He's great. And when he became chair, and I thought it would be a good time in my career, my life, to go back to get my MFA. And I focused solely on portraiture and portrait and figure, which is not what I'm known for. I'm always interested in it. I've taught it, but it's never something I've kind of designed whole shows around. And I decided to focus on it, kind of bring it to the level of finish and thoughtfulness that my interiors, I think, say. So I went back to school. I mean, tried to cultivate the novice mind again. And that's been a pretty profound thing for me.
In what way?
Well, I had to question my assumptions about the art that I was making. I think, I created rules for myself and palette restrictions and all these kinds of things over the years. And I was always cautious of maybe doing something that was too pretty or doing something that was trendy or something like that. And what I came to was that I had to be cautious about an abundance of caution in my work about what I was doing. And because there's to be a thoughtful painter, you can sometimes be too cautious, as opposed to being thoughtful in a way like, how do I expand? How can I, instead of maybe being seeking out the novel, seeking out maybe a sense of nuance that I didn't have before. And so I think that's, when in portraiture, it requires a different type of nuance, I think, than Diebenkorn style mark making or something like that. I was all of a sudden, that's one of the influences of my wife, is that she loves 19th century painting. And I sort of got more and more into this, whereas I would walk right by waterhouses in the past. I'd come back and look at a waterhouse or a Leighton and get in there and say, like, how on earth is this guy doing this? And because Velázquez always intrigued me because there's that flashiness to it, but that's almost impossible to attain because it's such a mystery. Whereas you look at a Leighton and you're like, it's not a mystery, it's just really good. So I started trying to slow down my brushstroke, trying to have sticky paint fused together, and just in kind of a mark making vocabulary that was foreign to me beforehand, where I would kind of scoff at kind of feathering edges and stuff like that. I would always want to kind of be like hacking through it and smushing and redoing and scraping and, this more from a Diebenkorn style art application of paint, that where you're seeing everything revealed to you as the marks are being done. And so I was trying to get into like a totally different mindset of nuance and also maybe trendy marks, using a squeegee. I'd never used a squeegee before. I was like, all right, let's see what this squeegee is all about. Squeegee, and then it was like, I was like, this is kind of fun. But I was maybe so hesitant before because it seemed like a kind of trendy thing to make like a sweet little painting, the squeegee part of it,
Yeah.
And wow, the audience. I was wary of this trick. So now I've put all those rules I had of myself aside because I don't know anymore. And I'm interested in making new work, interesting work, whatever that looks like.
What is it that makes you curious and want to discover something about painting? What is it that fascinates you and gets you going?
The reason I was interested in something new is that I noticed in myself a very dangerous precedent starting to happen with me, where I would go about, let's say I took a trip, I was traveling in such and such a place, and I would start looking for subject matter that fit within what I thought of as my own work. I started saying, what looks like a Kenny Harris painting in the world around me? As opposed to saying, what am I interested in? That looks cool. I want to investigate that. I started seeing what would fit into an already preconceived stratagem for making paintings. And that would, to me, all of a sudden, I realized I was going to repeat myself in a bad way, in a stale way, in a way that did not move the needle forward in any way. And that's when I realized I have to be open to that little spark of wonder and curiosity and like, how do I figure that out? And that's why I think portraiture is so interesting because, we can study faces all day.
Oh God, yeah.
And I used to draw and people all the time and all this, and I think I got out of the habit because of, again, where my career was. And I would do occasional figure paintings. They would sort of pop in and out of my body of works, but it was time to kind of focus on something that was something different to make me have a fresh eye, you know?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Do you see a distinction between a voice and a style? Because it sounds like you sort of had this idea of what your painting should be. Maybe that was some people would call that your style. And I know a lot of people are very conscious of or searching for their voice as a painter.
Voice versus style. I don't really have a good answer for that. let me think. Let me think about it.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, because so you're saying that you had this idea of who Kenny Harris, the painter, is. And then you would go look for things to fit into that. Mm-hmm. And so that to me sounds very different from this idea of curiosity that you ended up with.
Well, this is an ongoing evolution always.
Always, hopefully.
I think that one thing about, let's say, some of the empty interior spaces that I paint and stuff, there's a psychological character to them, which to me, I think embodies, let's say, a certain, it's not quite melancholy, it's like a strong solitude sort of emotion that makes me want to paint. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It's like the kind of downward gaze often or through a space in indirect light. There's a feeling of it that maybe it's your eyes unfocusing a little bit. You're maybe a little bit in your own head. And that's like a kind of nebulous intention. But if the paintings are done right, you look at a group of these paintings and it starts reorganizing the mind of the people looking at the paintings so that they can kind of get into that slightly introspective state. And that's kind of the early intentions to my work, but that's years ago. And so now I'm looking at a scene and I'm like, oh, it's a cool interior. It's great. But is that still my intention? Is that still the same little itch that I needed to scratch? I don't know. Maybe I'm more compelled by portraiture and people's faces and them, doing activities or them in their own spaces. And maybe that a little more of a narrative idea may be more important now. Mm-hmm. So it's like one's intention can shift. But when it comes to say something like your voice or your style, I feel like all that, you have an intention with a picture, you try your hardest to get it right. And wherever you fall short, that's kind of like your style. That's what you're stuck with. Like, why do I use a palette knife so much on the floor or whatever? It's because it's the only way I can do it. Like a brush won't hack it. I can't actually get the way I want to do it. So I kind of rely on these other things. And that's the best I can possibly do. Like that's what I can do. And that's my style. And
right.
Styles should be a leftover thing. It shouldn't be the first thing.
Right.
It should be the remnant of an investigation. But as far as voice, I'm not sure. I'll get back to you on that in a few years.
Okay. Well, yeah, it should be evolving, I think. I mean, I really hope, just speaking for myself, I really hope I'm not making the same paintings 10 years from now that I'm making now. I hope that I discover something else that absolutely fascinates me and I go down a different rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think that's maybe, do you know Andrew Hem? He was saying something the other day. He said something like, if you're not constantly looking back at your old work, knowing you can do better, like in his words, like disliking your old work, you're not evolving. Mm-hmm. So I think that's definitely has happened to me. I've now, this last few years, looking at portraiture and looking at sort of different subtle ways of creating marks and different more advanced vocabulary. I look back on my old work now, I'm like, oh man, I do that so much better. I do that so much better now. It's a positive thing. It's an evolution. But I think that a lot of the old work that I liked was stuff that I was doing from life, and you're not thinking so much. You're kind of trying to capture light before it goes away, and you're sort of in this automatic mode of responding to nature. And there's a real honesty to that. But that's hard to recapture. Do you know what I mean? That sort of honest search in the moment with urgency, I feel like is hard to fake.
Yeah. You mean, so when you're saying, give me an example where you're trying to recapture that.
So let's say I take a trip and I do a bunch of studies from life, but I also have some other photographs that I really love. Let's say the interior of a state that I can't set up and paint in, or in a church or something. I'm back in my studio trying to remember the light qualities, trying to infuse it with the urgency of observational painting from life, because that's what I want in the result. as opposed to acting like I have all the time in the world to consider every little thing. I want that sort of urgency where the things come together, where observations are constantly correcting previous observations. And that sort of energy to me is very exciting in painting. And so trying to manufacture it after the fact is tricky. I mean, and the thing is, if you're in practice with it, you can kind of do it, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a really great example. It's almost impossible it is impossible to fake that.
I mean, when you're in the practice of it, you can fake it. You can sort of emulate the mistakes and the searches of working from life, but you'll never get that same sort of connection to the subject. And I don't know. I think I lost my whole train of thought with this.
We're going too far down there.
We're going too deep. Yeah, there's a rabbit hole. I can get into many rabbit holes. But these are the complex things of what inspires and what motivates us, what makes for good painting, what makes for compelling painting. And the answers are quite complex. Sometimes you could have a little digital photograph that's really awful, but the inspiration is there to make an unbelievable painting that compels the viewer.
Yeah.
And other times you could have this, gorgeous setup working from life and have all the time in the world, and it doesn't matter.
Right.
You're always trying to capture that spark of what interests you, what compels you, and will thus compel the viewer.
Right. And that's in some ways getting a little bit harder and harder because it requires long bouts of concentration and focus. And like we kind of alluded to earlier, we're constantly being pulled in 1,000 different directions. So the ability to do that it's harder, but you have to really love what it is you're painting. And I think that's the thing that you can't fake. That fascination or curiosity is what makes that kind of crappy Polaroid that you were talking about turn into an amazing painting. Whereas, a really nice photograph with all the information may not be that interesting after all.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of the contemporary painting is so heavily reliant on photography. But I think that also goes along with the idea that digital photography is now easier to do, easier to come by, and take better photographs so that the information coming in, they can make really interesting painting choices off these photographs. And actually, one rule that I had with myself before is I almost never painted people from photographs. I only would paint them from life. And I think that's one thing that kind of restricted my advancement of portraiture and figure painting for me in my career, is that I would allow myself to work from interiors from photographs, because sometimes the travels wouldn't allow me to paint, from life all the time. And that I allowed myself that, but I didn't with the figures. And I think that's one rule I changed with myself in the last couple of years. I'm like, no rules. I can paint from photographs or not. It doesn't matter. Maybe I'll do a study from life with my friends, but then I'll do the actual studio painting from photography.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how those rules just kind of really hold you back. There was so much that I didn't do because I was taught oh, you shouldn't do that. And we can do whatever the hell we want. That's the truth. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, but if there's a compelling reason to do it, or what you're trying to achieve outweighs the crutch of not using that, then I don't see why not.
Yeah. And I think if you know how to teach yourself, I think that's the other thing. A lot of students, I see them, they don't know how to, let's say, paint a mouth very well. And they're looking at a photograph, let's say, and trying to work it out. And I would just tell them, go look at someone who paints a mouth great. Go look at, who do you like? Do you like Ang? Do you like Velasquez? Do you like David? Do you like Vincent Desiderio? It doesn't matter. Go and look at how they paint that mouth. Because they're interpreting it, and then you can look at how their interpretation simplifies the forms. And that's the kind of thing that the student doesn't quite get. They think the photograph is the answer, and it's just a piece of information.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I want to ask you, so we were talking earlier about the fact that you're married to another artist, and I'd love to hear how that relationship impacts your work, and how does Judy, is it?
Judy, yeah. Judy Nimtz. She's a very good painter, and it's a really unique sort of thing to be in a relationship with another painter that is very good. They can help you with your work. Sometimes it's difficult because we both deal with the same uncertainties of being an artist, like monetarily or whatever. But at the same time, we can travel together and paint together. We can go seek out shows and exhibits or talks, and we're not like dragging our significant other around. We're both into it, which I think is pretty awesome. And the fact that we, again, have our own critique system built in with each other, we can like help each other out with our work, and we don't feel artistically isolated. Like a lot of artists, they come to like say an art show or gathering, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm just so happy to come out and be able to talk about art with other people. And I'm like, what? Like that's every day,
That's breakfast.
Yeah. I mean, our huge wall of art books is our art books. You know what I mean? And we both have our different backgrounds and desires. She comes from a little bit more of a love of Pre-Raphaelite 19th century painting. For me, it's a little bit more modernism, and then also like Spanish painters. That's sort of how I kind of came up loving Velázquez, and also like the Dutch painters like Vermeer and all them, but then trying to smash it together with Dievenkorn and someone like that to like create a new vocabulary for myself.
How do those two different styles influence each other? Or backgrounds, I should say, maybe not styles.
Judy and I? Well, I think my interest in sort of a more finessed approach to painting is definitely part of her influence. And for my influence on her, I think, a more tonal palette knife based sort of, when we both go to Italy to paint almost every year. And when we're there, she's out painting the buildings and the stones with the palette knife and all these gray colors, which I love painting with gray. And so that's been influence on her, but her flesh palette is absolutely unique and so out of my realm of understanding. There's no way I could even come close to doing what she does, but the finesse that she does with the flesh transitions are so subtle that I think that's rubbed off on me when I've been trying to do some of these portraits, especially these, when I did a few that were sort of grisaille, really raw umber and white kind of sticky lead paint. It's nuances I could possibly be with my kind of short attention span. And, I think that's an influence of her.
Interesting.
Yeah. She's more line. She focuses more on linear shapes, and I focus more on tonal cohesion and smashing atmospheric perspective and reflections and everything together. So like when I'm working on a portrait or a drawing, she can come in and actually help me with the drawing and see things that I can't see, and she can be tough with me. And I thank myself for making such a smart decision. I thank her because she can help me. She can keep me honest. And the funniest thing also is that as an artist, we have to have our own kind of egocentric idea of our lives, and like what we're doing is so important. And the thing is we're both painters, so it doesn't work with her. I can't just be like, I must paint in the studio.
I'm an artist.
Yeah, exactly. That stops me from basically believing my own hype. So that is the best thing on earth, because I could definitely go down a wormhole of, as a lot of artists can, about believing their own hype. And being married to another artist that you respect keeps you in check.
I'd love to hear if there was a moment or a decision that you made in your career that you feel, aside from marrying Judy, was a personal success, or really something that ended up being really impactful for either your career or your growth as an artist.
Well, there've been a couple little markers. I think my first solo show in Chelsea, that was like, whoa, that was a big. I think one that was just kind of personally on the inside was big deal to me. The decision to be an artist and move away from the animation life and that kind of career, I think it was somewhere around 2006. I made more money as a painter than I did as an animator. And this is on paper, selling work through galleries. Like that was to me a big deal, in that I kind of justified it to myself that this is a career you can do, you can make money at, you can be successful. That was to me a big marker.
That's huge.
Yeah, it boosts your own, not confidence is not even the right word, but your belief that what you're doing is work, it's a job, it'll pay your bills, and hopefully it'll pay your bills till you die. It's a career, not a hobby. It's a life, not a lifestyle. You know what I mean? It was a marker that to me somehow inside my own head that was really important.
Yeah, it's a huge validation, and it's inspiring. It keeps you motivated and going, because otherwise you can just spin your wheels. And it's not that, nobody does this for the money. Otherwise, we'd all be lawyers or something else. I don't know, who is it now that makes all the money? But at the same time, it's an important piece of the validation. There's creating something that you really are proud of and feel good about, and then sharing it with other people. And then the final step really is that somebody is willing to give you money for this so that you can then keep going.
Yeah. And it seems shallow to think that way, but you know the old joke where it's businessmen get together and talk about art and artists get together and talk about money?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like that idea that artists are, for better for worse, are kind of obsessed by making ends meet, because that, even though it's a distraction, it's a very real distraction, and it takes us away from the creative process all the time, the worry about money. And if you are confident that what you're doing is not only to your creative benefit, but will also be for your financial benefit, it's kind of reinforces how you're spending your time, the decisions you're making with your life, as opposed to the other way when you're not selling a lot of work and things are not going very well. Doubt creeps in, and you're like, am I doing the right thing? Is this going to sell? I mean, that's the worst thing that can pop into your head, is starting thinking about, is this going to sell? Because again, it's that personal conviction that will make compelling work. So that's why the money thing shouldn't be discounted. If you can figure out how to have a passive income that's not art related or something like that, you know, some way where you can take the money out of the equation, it helps you immensely. However, there's also this motivation when you're young, especially, to paint a lot to make money. Like there's a spark that can, deadlines that you have to hit because you're trying to kind of promote your career, that can also be helpful in certain ways, but it's not sustainable. That's what I feel.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the whole like artist obsession with money and not wanting to talk about money and wanting to pretend like money has nothing to do with the art, you know, because
oh man,
it does. And I think that when we start worrying about, will this sell? That thought, I think, only comes when our other needs aren't met, when we're basically getting to the point where we're approaching or in that financial desperation. Mm-hmm. That's the only time that thought happens. So if, you know, like when we find ways to solve those problems with our work or in whatever way we need to, then we're free to paint.
It's interesting. Yeah.
And it's this chicken and the egg thing. It's really difficult and really complicated. There's, you know, lots of people who I get lots of emails and questions from people about, you know, gosh, I really want to quit my job. And what do I do to quit my job? Right. Mm-hmm. And the way I look at it is your job is kind of your modern day patron, you know, whoever it is that you just despise for being there, that you have to go in and sit at that desk or do whatever it is that you do. That's allowing you to paint. And if you can shift your mindset that way, mm-hmm. then all of a sudden it becomes easier, and that job isn't sucking the life out of you. It is paying for you to continue to paint and do what you need to do until you start selling it. And then you can kind of back off a little bit from the work, or you have choices that you can make, but you need to have that freedom, that financial freedom, in order to have those choices. Otherwise you're kind of stuck doing anything to get the rent paid or the mortgage paid.
Yeah. The tough thing in the whole equation with working like a full-time job and also trying to paint is momentum is so important mm-hmm. in painting. And mm-hmm. I think that's where like residencies come in. If you can take a month-long break from your job and, you know, save up the money and then go and spend 4 dedicated weeks away from the day-to-day, away from the distractions, and move the needle along in your creative process. I think that's the kind of thing that you have to do. And that also, that month-long or 6-week-long focus may also gel a show together that will then give you the confidence to maybe work part-time and do take those little steps toward mm-hmm. a type of financial split between art and the jobby job. But it's also like a double-edged sword. Like you were saying, making all your money from your art is a double-edged sword, because the pressures come from what you love is what you need mm-hmm. to pay your rent. And what if things aren't coming slow? What if you have no good ideas? What if you needed time just to sit and read books to fill the batteries up, you know? Mm-hmm. To be a production artist is a very particular type of existence.
Yeah. And that's why I think what one of those old timers or whatever told you is really, really important to keep in mind, is that there is always an ebb and flow. So there's always going to be times in between when there's not a lot of cash coming in, and, it's a roller coaster.
Yeah. And another thing I heard advice was given once is sometimes, let's say you change your style or you evolve your subject matter or something, and it may not catch on with collectors for years, for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Meanwhile, you may have moved on and you've just, you're so sad, but the collectors will eventually come around to the work, but you have to make sure you can kind of weather that storm. And that's hard too. And being a professor is takes a lot of energy also. So, and there's no guarantee you'll get a full-time job teaching. That's hard to find.
Yeah.
It's a rough,
we did not choose the easy path.
No. And I think when I was young and naive when I started this job, and I thought it was fun and easy and let's just go travel. But I was lucky, and it kind of gave me a leg up because I got to do all that work for all those years. But it's also fun to kind of take stock like I've been doing the last few years, and money has been tighter because of the recession, but I'm not burning myself out like I used to be,
Yeah, which is really important. And I think, designing your life so that it's the life that you want and not the life you're supposed to have or that somebody else thinks you should have. So whatever that is, this is a huge generalization, but there is this concept called enough, that I guess what I'm thinking is, in the United States, at least, we don't, in general, understand what real poverty is. And so if you have a cell phone, by default, you're doing way better than most people in this world.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because you can afford to buy that thing and keep it up and just things like that. So we have these super, super high expectations or desires that are either internal or are being fed to us from other places. But what I was thinking about when you were talking about when you were younger and traveling and stuff, you didn't have a lot of needs.
No.
And you didn't have a lot of expenses.
No.
So I know a lot of people who basically have, and this is a huge extreme, and I'm not suggesting everybody should live their lives this way, but I'm just saying as a contrast, there are plenty of people who basically just sell everything and with $30,000 can travel the world for like years. And they're totally fine, totally happy. They're fed, nothing, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And they're not in a hurry to accomplish whatever it is they think they should be accomplishing.
Right.
Their brain probably has time to relax. And if they're artists, they can think the more deep, profound thoughts, which we have to think, but that there's a ongoing fight for our attention in this society. And I keep thinking about how to just give more mental space to myself. And I feel like I used to have it. I would travel, I'd go, and there was no phones, there's no computer with you all the time. You just would sit there and read and think and draw and interpret the world in your own head. And now I feel like a lot of it's coming from the outside with these mobile phones and stuff. And I don't know what the answer is, really. I think it's too late to just turn away from it all. But there has to be a way to kind of reclaim, especially for young people, it's going to be their struggle to reclaim their attention. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we all, at the end of the day, we're all making our own choices, right? So as enticing as social media is, it's my choice when I use it. And I'm not saying I always make the best choices, but nobody's putting a gun to my head and making me do that. So I can decide that I'm only going to spend 5 minutes a day on it, and I can make that work. You know what I mean? Like you can decide what you're going to do and stick to it. And this is something that my husband and I have been kind of struggling with too, just that when we make choices to buy things, then you kind of have the responsibility of keeping that up, or you have this thing that is in your house, or even the house itself. Like you've made the decision to buy a house. So now you're kind of, your perception, whether it's true or not, is that you're locked in for the next 30 years, or you're locked in for X number of years until you can, sell the house and make your whatever back. Right. But those are all, I guess what I'm trying to say is that those choices that we make, we assume that the consequences are X, Y, and Z, when the consequences are kind of infinite. So if you look at the choice to buy a house, you could buy a house and then decide that was the wrong decision and sell it and take the cut
Mm-hmm.
and go off and live a simpler life.
Or rent it out and go off and live a simpler life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and then, the choice of renting it comes with, then you have to manage it and this, that, and the other.
Mm-hmm.
But everything has its consequences, but it's not as set in stone as we think. If we're willing to say, I would rather take a short-term hit so that my long-term life is much more relaxed and sustainable for me. And I'm not constantly worried about how am I going to pay that mortgage, as one example.
Yeah. And the artist is dealing with, there's no retirement. There's no real end game. We'll do this until we can't hold a brush. That's sort of why we're in it, because you learn forever. There's no forced retirement age, which I love that idea, and it also terrifies me. the idea there's no ends plan, but
right.
I don't know that the next generation they're going to have an interesting relationship with money, house ownership, car ownership, all that stuff. I bet there may be a whole new tribe of nomads.
Yeah.
That can roam around and have short-term rentals, short-term car rentals, short-term this, short-term that.
The extended Airbnb.
Yeah, and maybe that they'll be better and smarter for it and have kind of these different kind of global networks because of it. I mean, I think it definitely has helped if you have some sort of stability, like a parent or something that will help the young people so they have a base they can fall back on. So I feel like as a young artist, that was a huge advantage to me, just having, supportive parents. And I felt like I could kind of go off and try it in New York or try it in LA. And if things totally failed, I could kind of limp home and figure things out. And
lick your wounds.
Yeah, but that gave me just the confidence to go for it, to take risks, to take chances. And I think that's something that, if you have those, don't take that kind of stuff for granted. If you have that sort of advantage, then take risks and try to make yourself happy. Try to make the art that you really want to create, because there's a lot of people that don't have that safety net, and it's much more difficult for them to take the risks as a young artist. I also think as an older artist, if you're an empty nester and you have more financial stability, you can take more risks. You can make, you don't need the sales, you can really try to find your voice. Yeah. End of thought. Sorry.
End of thought. Done. Click. Yeah. I think I'm just trying to encourage people to look at things from multiple angles and not just assume that we're locked into the way things are. And the more risks that you take, or the more chances that you take when you don't know how things are going to turn out, it's a weird thing. It's like building a muscle. The next one becomes easier. You kind of get your footing, you get your confidence in it, and you realize, wow, I did that and the world didn't end.
Yeah, our brain makes all these constructions about how things are and what you need, how it has to be, and they're complete constructions. You could step off and go grape picking for a year, for a season in France or something like that, and just have these crazy experiences, especially again as a young person. But the construction of that you can't do that, you have to do A, B, and C, is completely invented. And I think especially as artists, we have to be always looking at things from a new vantage point, a new perspective, trying to figure out what's really important, what we're trying to actually express,
right? What
has to be said right now, not as some antique idea, but as a idea for right now and how we look at the world. And I think perceptual painters, dealing with slow time is really important to, almost like an antidote to the modern experience.
Yeah, it is. It's almost, an active revolution to slow down and spend 6 hours staring at one thing.
Yeah, it's as we all know, for us that do it, it's like meditation. It's just not as calming, but it does something to kind of rewire our brains, and that alone is about as worthy a thing that we can do. Yeah,
I'm all for it.
yeah, it's an act of rebellion, like you said.
So, last question for you.
Okay.
What single habit do you strongly believe contributes to your growth as an artist?
I cannot say that I have a single habit that is responsible for my success. There's a bunch of things. One is a certain non-preciousness, I think, is crucial in your work, both for the making of the art and the letting go of the art. That's not a habit, though. That's just a non-preciousness. That's a state of being. I think setting yourself up for the next day of work is really important. This is something I struggle with all the time, but I know it's important to do, and I try to do as often as I can, which is the idea that you're not just working for the one day, the one awesome 10-hour painting stretch. You're trying to set it up so every day when you come in, you're excited to get right back into what you were doing. And so sometimes what that means is if you're painting really well up until, let's say, the time when you like to stop, let's say it's at 5 p.m. or whatever, you're painting really well. You know you can kind of knock everything out if you painted for just 2 more hours, but you don't do that. You stop, you maybe scrape out the edges a little bit, and you set yourself up so you know exactly what you're doing the next day. You return to the piece. Writers are good about this. The career writers, they have a set time. And they try to, if things are going really well, they stop. So they come in the next day, they can keep going. As opposed to things are going real well, you finish the stop completely. And then the next day, it's very hard to come back in and enter it. And I think painting can be very similar.
Yes.
And I think that sort of long view is really important. Or just know that if you do work these long days and you completely close out the idea, that it's going to be very hard to open it back up. And that you have to then set that painting aside and take something else out, again, setting yourself up for the next day. So that's a habit that I think about a lot. I'm not always the most disciplined at doing it. Sometimes my immediate gratification gets the better of me. But it's something that I think is really important for artists to think about, how to scrape things out, how to soften an edge in order to come back in the next day. To maybe have a painting medium that dries by the next day so that you can work into it. You're not stuck with a big wet painting that you can't work into. Again, depending on what style you do, but always thinking about how to glaze something back so the next day you can paint into it or whatever it is.
I'm trying to remember who, I think it was Hemingway. I might have this wrong, who he would stop in the middle of a sentence purposely.
That sounds right. I know he was religious about his writing time, and I think it was something like 7 a.m. to noon or something. And it was the same time every day, and he would stand at his typewriter, he wouldn't sit. And that was it. So, and I think that's why he would get drinking early in the day, so he'd be sober by the time 7 a.m. came around. I think that's probably his system. But I think it's a type of thing when you're, as an artist, you have to think of yourself as a professional, just in the sense that you go to work every day, whether you feel like it or not, whether you're inspired or not. That's sort of an amateur idea. You want to come in setting yourself up every day for success. I used to, when I had big painting days in the past, on big paintings, I might go the night before and mix out paint, like mix out my big palette.
Oh,
and
that's
then
good.
The next morning come in. Because sometimes when I was mixing out palettes, it would take, an hour of mixing. And sometimes that's a nice kind of meditative way to get ready for the day of work. But if I knew I needed, 9 hours of painting in a day to have a big painting be open, I might do all the mixing the night before and have these big piles of paint. And then when I walked in the next morning, it was all like the painting was already happening while I was sleeping. Right. I was already going through the motions of it and then coming to the studio very motivated.
I love it. Kenny, thank you so much for talking with me. This is great.
Thank you very much for having me.
Many thanks to Kenny Harris for sharing his story with us. You can see Kenny's paintings and get links to everything that we talked about at savvypainter.com/podcast. If you know another artist who would benefit from this conversation about the cyclical nature of the art world, Kenny's process, or how we grow and evolve as artists, please do me a favor, share this episode. One more thing I want to let you know. This year, you can expect a lot more workshops from Savvy Painter. If you are an artist who struggles with getting painting time in or feels like you're always busy but never really moving forward with your art, then my workshops just might interest you. Past workshops include Mindset Mastery, a 5-week online workshop to help you get past the roadblocks that keep you from painting. In it, we tackle the inner critic, fears of artists, and setting yourself up for a successful creative day. The workshop, How to Develop a Relationship with the Right Gallery, helped several artists find the right gallery and show their work. So if this is something that interests you, you can go to savvypainter.com/workshop and get on the email list. This is separate from the main list that tells you when a new episode comes out. This is just for the workshop, so you don't get quite as many emails, but when you do, there's always something really good happening. Sign up now and get a downloadable PDF with case studies that tell you exactly how 3 artists pushed through barriers that were getting in the way of their studio time. You can, for example, learn how Rhonda went from not wanting to call herself an artist to getting her very first solo show. Also, listen to an introverted artist describe how she built her confidence and then spoke in front of an audience of her peers. And you can discover the tools that Samantha used to take back her power after a decade of believing that she had no, I'm putting air quotes there, she had no talent. So again, go to savvypainter.com/workshop to reserve your place on the list. When you sign up, you get that downloadable case studies that I mentioned, but more importantly, you get exclusive invites to upcoming workshops. Most of the time when I launch a new program, it sells out before I ever announce it publicly. So reserve your spot now at savvypainter.com/workshop. Until next week, this is Antrice Wood with the Savvy Painter Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.